the data, everything from the testimonials to the survey responses to the photo data collected. So while I could go through all the like pictures of it, I thought it'd be fun to actually bring up the website and walk you guys through what it looks like. So you can see right away, we have this nice overview landing page. Up at the top, this is a timeline showing every form submission, color-coded by which fridge it's from. So like at the top, that's Portland in purple. That's the fridge that's actually right next to this building. Here on the overview, this is actually a data visualization for our testimonials. So we took some of the stories that were particularly impactful, and we came up with different fridge magnet designs based on each story. And if you hover over a fridge magnet, you can view the corresponding testimonial for that fridge magnet design. And this is actually expandable. We have this little sticky note at the top where our sponsors, if they get more testimonials, can put them in the Google Sheet. And then anyone who visits the site can left click on the sticky note and scroll through different testimonials that are added after our time. Next, we have gauges showing the amount of submissions per fridge. You can see Portland has the most. It's the highest foot traffic fridge. You can take a look at it on your way out. It's right by the front door of this building. All of the graphs on this website dynamically adjust when you move around this timeline on the top. So you can specify like, okay, I want to look at data starting from November 6th. You can move around the end date. Everything will adjust live. Finally, on the overview page, we have this wheel that shows a line corresponding to each fridge and which foods people are requesting at that fridge. So this is an example of how effective data visualization can actually help our sponsor with their practices. So like, for example, a lot of these lines dip on bread. So our sponsor might be able to say, okay, people have enough bread. We don't need to prioritize bread. Whereas fruit, especially at the Brooks fridge, this green one, is being requested disproportionately often. So that allows our sponsor to take donations and effectively make decisions about which fridges to dedicate that food to. My partner here, Tyler, will now go over the fridge page. We have one page for each fridge.
So each fridge has its own unique page. It starts out with a nice picture of the fridge and a little history of the fridge next to it, just to kind of give some nice context for that data and the history of the fridges. Below that is a timeline. This timeline actually holds a lot of data. Each bubble has a size that corresponds to how full the fridge was when the form was submitted. So the bigger the bubble, the fuller the fridge. The height on the chart corresponds to how clean it was when it was submitted. So if you mouse over one of those little bubbles, it'll actually bring up if an image was submitted, and you can see on that time. And like Dimitri said on the overview page, that little scroller at the top will update the timeline as you scroll to change the data. Below that, you have a pie chart, which kind of gives some context as to why people went to the fridge when they submitted the form. So it kind of helps us gauge where that data came from. So you know who was shopping and what they requested, or who was adding and how clean it was. And below that, we have a temperature gauge over here. This temperature gauge will show green when the temperature is reported as just right and a good temperature. And if you get too many readings that say it's too warm, the gauge will actually turn red and notify whoever's seeing the website that the fridge needs some attention. And if it's too cold, it'll turn blue. The line charts here show the stock level and cleanliness of the fridge over time, and it helps us to see any trends, like as you can see towards the December months when it gets colder, there's a little bit less food in the fridge, and I'm assuming people need it more. And last but not least, on each page, there's a bubble chart, which corresponds to what people said they wanted to see more of in the fridge. And the size of these bubbles corresponds to what people wanted more. So as you can see, fruit is very popular, and bread, not as much. And James is going to handle Union, since Union has 2 extra graphs that corresponds to the photo that we deployed there.
As you can see on the Union tab, we have 2 extra graphs. The graph over here on the left shows the activity by hour from our photo data. And as you can see that the door gets opened most often around lunchtime, which generally makes sense. And then on the blurb here on our right, it shows how many times the door has been opened since our system was in place. And as we see, it's been opened 428 times since we put it in, and with an average of about 96-second openings. And then at the graph here at the bottom, you can see if you hover over any of the data points, it shows the date and the amount of times the fridge has been opened on that day. And then everything, of course, gets adjusted when you adjust the timeline at the top of the page, and all the data points change.
All right, so that covers everything that our website does and visualizes. So now going back to our presentation, the final step is our recommendations for our sponsor. Now, I should stress that the purpose of our project was to create the data collection tools rather than gather the data. So all of our recommendations are not about like the data that was collected, but about how to use the data and the tools effectively. So starting off with our first recommendation, that is monitor the portal for different requested foods. We talked about this before. By looking at what foods are being requested at what fridges, our sponsor can make decisions about how to allocate food that's been donated between the fridges.
Our next recommendation would be to share data with other community fridges. While we network and share our user manuals, any data collected could benefit any community fridges involved, find out what works, find out what doesn't, and just improve them as a whole.
And next, since the more data that we collect, the more effective our data collection tool is, and you can draw more meaningful insights from it. Our recommendation is to promote use of our fridge surveys on social media so it gains more traction.
And similar to that, we have another recommendation, which is to promote use of the survey in person. A large demographic of the fridge users may not be actively using social media as much, but their voice is very important to factor into decisions about how the community organization is run. So staying by the fridges, walking people through how to submit the surveys in person is a very good way to make sure all voices in the community are heard.
An additional note would be to cross-reference photo data with major events. So if our sponsor puts out like a notification on social media and they see a large uptick in fridge activity, that's something to note and keep track of, as well as if there's like a snowstorm and they see a downtick in fridge activity, it's just something to help kind of keep track of and recognize trends.
And finally, after hosting our focus group, we learned that a lot of these volunteers have powerful stories that the community should know about. So we think that for our last recommendation, that hosting more events focused on the community would empower people to use the fridge more after seeing all the meaningful stories that people tell.
All right, nice. So I'd like to extend a very large thank you to our advisor, Laura, and I'd like to thank our contacts with Blue Fridges, Maria and Julia. They were incredibly supportive. We could not have asked for better sponsors. In addition, I'd like to thank the kind gentleman down at Teriyaki Japan in the Worcester Public Market, keeping us well fed and productive. And I'd like to thank all of you guys for coming out here this afternoon and listening to our presentation. Any questions? Yes.
Based upon the number of door openings that you track and the number of surveys that you receive, do you know what percentage of people opening the door actually fill out the surveys?
So a very small percentage. On consistent days, we get around 50 to 60 door openings, and usually we get 1 to 3 surveys a day. Based on also off of the fact that users can optionally submit their name on a survey, we know the surveys, at least right now, are submitted by a very consistent few folks who are usually active volunteers who are bringing food. We're hoping that expands as time goes on. Yeah,
What do you think was the greatest challenge you had with the project?
I would love to.
Yeah, so I can take it.
Installing the photo is definitely a challenge. We wanted to install it down here on Portland. We tested it with an empty box that ended up getting taken down, and finding a nice place to keep it weatherized and protected was a challenge in how to install that. But we found a nice spot on Union, got that installed, but it took longer than we expected.
Yeah.
And adding on to that, we actually have a little demo of it, if any of you guys want to take a look at it, pass it around, how our device actually works. It's very compact and we're able to put it into the user fridge with ease.
Yeah. Any other questions? Yes.
Do you have any anecdotes about how the data has been used up to this point, putting volunteers into action to respond to some of the surveys?
Yeah, so actually last week we got a lot of reports from the main fridge that mentioned that the fridge was too warm. Or not the main fridge, the Union fridge that mentioned that the fridge was too warm. And I think a couple of volunteers went out there and checked on it, and the fridge had like turned off. So they were able to reboot that. So that kind of got us some good early alerts on it.
That's awesome.
Okay, any other? Yes.
Really nice presentation and great work, guys. Could you clarify who was filling out the survey? Is it just volunteers who are going to check on the fridge, or is it a lot of users?
Yeah, so in theory, the survey, the best way to access the survey, we didn't mention this before, is a QR code that's on each of the fridge that links to the corresponding survey. In our experience, I'd say maybe like 95 anecdotally % of the surveys are from people who are either donating food or just checking up on the fridges, like if they're walking by. We have had a couple surveys from people who are shopping, and we are hoping that once the tools and all this like presentation and everything is shared around the social media, knowledge of the surveys will increase and shoppers will start submitting more surveys as time goes on.
Great, thank you.
Thank you guys very much.
All right.
Is it the wrong order?
That's okay.
Are we up next?
Yes, you are.
What did I say? I was.
Or, I think the volume on this one is.
It's better on All right. Yeah, we're ready.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming to our TED Talk today on increasing environmental literacy in Worcester through STEM learning modules. Glad to see you all here. All right, my name is Eddie. I'm a mechanical engineering major.
I'm Deborah, I'm an ECE major.
I'm Tony, I'm a computer science major.
I'm John, I'm also an ECE major. Alright, so I'll start everybody off with some background here to get to speed with our project. So something we mentioned a lot in our report and later on in the presentation is environmental literacy. Essentially all you need to know is environmental literacy, it's the combination of knowledge, practical skills, and behaviors in regards to the environment. Like an example of an environmentally literate person would be a volunteer who actively goes out and uses all their skills to clean up the environment, something like that. One of the main, I guess, aspects of environmental literacy is awareness. And that kind of leads to our secondary goal for modules, which is to raise awareness about cyanobacteria and understanding it. So cyanobacteria by itself, it's a perfectly normal part of the ecosystem, but during cyanobacteria bloom, what will happen is the population of cyanobacteria will grow exponentially, so much so that it will start to block sunlight from reaching the bottom of the water. And eventually so much cyanobacteria will start to grow that will also die in exponential quantities, and then the process of decomposition will end up depleting the oxygen in the water and killing any type of aquatic life. Now, a lot of the triggers for cyanobacteria is human contamination. Some of the ways to kind of mitigate the impact of like human impacts, contamination is through community science. Community science is any type of scientific project that uses the community to help gather information and data. In our case, a good example is the website iNaturalist. It's a type of social network for gathering biodiversity data. Basically, anybody around the globe can go outside and take pictures of nature, plants, and insects, and upload it to the website to help kind of meet with other people, maybe contact experts. But then, in particularly in regards to Worcester specifically, another example of community science is the Worcester Cyanobacteria Monitoring Lab.
So WCPC is a group of community science volunteers who regularly throughout the year go to their local lakes and ponds and take water samples that they bring back for testing to make sure that all of the local water bodies have safe cyanobacteria levels. And our sponsor, Jacqueline, the coordinator of the WCMC, she came to WPI and us looking for help with creating learning modules that the WCMC could use for helping spread environmental literacy throughout Worcester. So for our goal, we decided that we would base our project on creating STEM learning modules to increase environmental literacy in Worcester by using the methods and procedures of the WCMC. So our methodology, how are we going to do this? Basically, we came up with a plan of reviewing the WCMC protocols, seeing what materials they have that we can use for learning modules, and then identifying the target audience for our learning modules, and designing the modules themselves, and then piloting the modules. So for objective 1, reviewing WCMC protocols, we decided we would interview WCMC volunteers and leadership, kind of get a feel for all of their ideas and what their thoughts on our project were, and also get to know them, get a strong understanding of the WCMC and what's it all about. And also reviewing the WCMC's volunteer training materials, so we can be fully familiar with that and all the testing and water sampling procedures, so we can share that information in our learning modules and with others to the best of our abilities.
All right, so our second objective was to analyze and to identify the target audience, and we decided to do this so we could know which age group would benefit the most from the development of this curriculum. How we decided to approach this was to analyze the Massachusetts curriculum frameworks, also to research crowd program planning, and also to conduct interviews to collect data. We made some interviews with the STEM Education Center, with some of Worcester Public Schools teachers, with a Cub Scout Master, and also with a Scout Master.
For objective 3, we designed these lesson plan modules. So the WPI STEM Education Center helped us a lot on this. They gave us 2 potential lesson plan formats that we could use that could be implemented in Worcester public schools. So one of them integrated STEM modules. It was very ELA focused. That requires learning materials that would be rigid and not possible for our goals, because we wanted instructors to modify these materials as they needed. So we went with an IM STEM learning lesson plan, which was more objective focused and modifiable in the future.
Right. And for the 4th objective, it was piloting modules. What we did is we ran a pilot with the Cub Scouts and Scouts, and the whole purpose of it was to test out what we had, all of our lesson plans and our activities, see what worked, what was age appropriate, what wasn't, and see what essentially had to be changed.
So for our findings, what did we find from these? Basically, from our first objective, from our review of WCMC protocols, we found that the WCMC sampling methods and testing themselves were a perfect exercise for our learning modules to use. That would be a very simple, easy, and fun introduction for people to an environmental science project. And from our interviews with WCMC volunteers and leadership, we found that they all kind of agreed upon the idea that would be most beneficial for people to take away from the learning modules was getting a hands-on learning experience, collecting samples and testing them in the outdoors in their local community, using a scientific method toward research.
So after collecting all the data from objective 2, we found out that middle schoolers are the type target audience. From our interviews with the STEM Education Center, we discovered that there's a recommended age for microscope use and also lab equipment use. From our analysis of the Massachusetts curriculum framework, we found out that there's already an allocated time for STE, and also that some of the frameworks are more flexible and others more significant on the age and grade. And also from our interviews with the Scouts and Cub Scouts, we found out that both of them are a good target audience as long as we adapt activities according to their age.
Okay, so at the end of this project, we implemented our pilot modules with the Cub Scouts and the Scouts. So as you can see in the images, we set up testing stations and connected our laptops to the microscopes to view cyanobacteria, which Scouts actually found in the lakes and tested in. So we had Scouts move around the lakes and use WCMC protocols to collect water samples and view microorganisms. After conducting these pilot testings, we had some surveys for the parents of the Scouts. So as you can see, around 60% of the parents say that their children do not get enough STEM opportunities as often as they would like, be that be in school or as part of Scouts programs. And 80% of them would like to see more things being implemented in the future. Every single parent that we asked said it was their child's first time using a microscope, and they would like to see them get more hands-on experience with scientific procedures and using these.
So So our main deliverable was a handbook. The WCMC Learning Modules Handbook. It's a handbook which contains all our lesson plans. There are 4 lesson plans for middle schoolers, 2 lesson plans for scouts, and 2 lesson plans for Cub Scouts. The handbook also contains a table from all the data we collected from visiting the Moon Hill Farm, Cold Reservoir, Indian Lake, and Belmont that are parks in Worcester. This table contains parking information, accessibility, location, and also if there's a good pavilion and good water sample testing areas.
So as mentioned before, for the scouts, we wanted to have a focus on more hands-on experience. So as you can see, in activity 1 for scouts and Cub Scouts, we asked them to go around the lake, survey the location, and make observations about the local flora and fauna and what they noticed about it. Activity 2 and 3 have them go near the shoreline, collect water samples using the graph bottle or rifle samples, which are WCMC's testing protocols, and view and collect and view microorganisms under a microscope. Each for Scouts and Scouts, we made 2 lesson plans. The first lesson plan involves them going near a lake and collecting water samples. The second lesson plan is in case they don't get permission and they can to go in the lake and they can still get hands-on experience near a park or any open area.
Okay, so unfortunately we couldn't test our lesson plans for the middle schoolers. However, all of them are available on the handbook. We have 4 lesson plans, one about community science, another about ecological relationship, other about scientific analysis, and one about microorganisms. All the lesson plans have all the material needed. This is an example of the lesson plan 3, Introduction to Scientific Analysis. All of them have the objective, the ST standards, the material needed for each lesson, and the key vocabularies. Also a table with the recommended format from the WPI STEM Education Center.
Alright, so for our recommendations, we have 3 main recommendations. The first one is the further collaboration with the Girl Scouts of Western Central Massachusetts. So currently they're in their summer camp and developing a STEM room at Worcester WPI, and we're hoping that maybe our modules would be a good fit and probably integrate with them. All right, and then our next 2 recommendations is the first one is collaborating with the Worcester Public Library. Our idea is right now a lot of our interactive activities are based around the WCMC field kit. What we're hoping is that we can provide maybe 3 or 5 field kits to the public library, and then any type of instructor or scout leader could go out and check out a field kit as opposed to a book and be able to actually do these activities. And then the final ultimate recommendation is we're hoping that we can use our sponsor can use our modules as a justification to develop a mobile STEM laboratory, otherwise known as the Big Blue Bus. Essentially, right now, the biggest hurdle to actually doing these modules will probably be whether or not the instructors have access to microscopes and the scientific equipment. By having this mobile laboratory, you'll be able to bring the scientific tools to students, be able to introduce everybody more to STEM.
So thank you all so much for coming to our presentation or our TED Talk. And also we'd like to particularly thank Laura for her advice for us the past semester, giving us through this, and also our fellow cohort teams supporting us and giving their ideas as we went along. But particularly want to thank our sponsor, Jacqueline, for supporting us in this and giving us this awesome opportunity to get so involved with the Worcester community. And thank you all so much for coming to our presentation. Any questions?
I think it was a wonderful idea for you guys to decide to make nice, compact STEM modules for the students. What were the factors you considered in making those STEM modules? You showed pictures there. Like, how did you go about making sure that they're an effective way of teaching, being sure that the students are getting just the right amount of data, not being overloaded with these small, compact pieces of information?
So for the schools specifically, we interview teachers and they ask us to make modules that are about half an hour long, because that's generally the amount of time they can give like 2 extra classes. So within these half an hour modules, we wanted them to have real Worcester data, like get data from the WCMC website and have them find patterns in it to get an understanding of how cyanobacteria, like any algae, usually develops over time, things like that. And in the final module is where they will get the hands-on experience with microscopes. if they are not going to filter. For scouts, we already know they're going to filter, so we wanted to have them move around for like an hour or so and just look at the flora and fauna. For the younger scouts, they would honestly just make notes of the observation result, and for the older scouts, get right into field testing and collecting the data science.
When you were out there with the scouts, what were they most excited about when they were using all these tools?
I think definitely, so a lot of the older ones anyway, getting to see and get their hands on the microscopes and see what they were looking at in the water samples, and also comparing them with like the posters we had of like the actual cyanobacteria, diatoms, and other microorganisms. They really love kind of comparing and contrasting those and seeing what they can find. At least that's what I noticed they got kind of the most excited about.
I think initially we thought that we would spend around 15 to 20 minutes collecting water samples and have them look around, but that having them look around, like the time went by relatively quickly, around 5-10 minutes. Most of the time is when they were like be on the laptop, moving the microscope around and seeing what they could find through the microscope and comparing it to the charts that CMC provided. And those are
It was also super cold out, so that might have kind of affected kind of how much time you want to spend with them running around. Steve?
Yeah, it was really good, thank you. Did you consider any audiences other than scouts and school settings? Especially thinking about adult audiences, and would this maybe be also appropriate for like retirees or interested in things or like special needs populations?
And this is kind of the initial goal of our modules was kind of to give something that WCMC can reuse whenever they want in the future. So like it's kind of open to whoever they can use it with. Like it doesn't have to be just like middle schoolers and kids. It can also be anyone like some adult learning center that wants to like use them. They can WCMC can take these learning modules and bring them to them and use them with any group that they like.
How much, do you know how much microscope is that this particular set?
So all the microscope we used was provided as a part of the science scope by our sponsor, Japan. So we used 3 microscopes, and we're not sure how many microscopes WCMC has currently, but one of the recommendations they say that we want Worcester Public Library to get in touch with WCMC and have them coordinate, to provide microscopes to the general public or like schools and scoutmasters as they
Yeah, and so like if in terms of like financial costs, like if the WCMC needs more microscopes and field kits to use for these additional projects and learning modules, hopefully with these recommendations and WCMC could show that to the city of Worcester, and the city of Worcester can give them the funding they need for more field kits so they can be used for education.
This project affect you guys' education on cyanobacteria? Are you guys familiar with it beforehand, or is this like a learning experience for you too?
It was definitely a huge learning experience, and I think we're all basically on the same page. You heard our majors, none of us have anything to do with biology. So I had no idea cyanobacteria was a thing, but that this was like a worldwide issue. So it was really cool getting to learn that early on and kind of getting to and go from initially learning about it to teaching others about it. That was pretty awesome.
But then one thing we didn't expect while doing this was we needed to learn about cyanobacteria, but the one thing that we came across was seeing how, like, from the instructor's perspective, what they think about, what they have to keep in consideration while creating modules about educating other people. These weren't things that we had thought about before, so this is like a new experience for us.
Great. Thank you. If anyone wants to get up and grab some lunch off on your treats, feel free to do so. reason this microphone stopped working, so.
Yeah, I don't know.
It's going. Let's, give him like 2 minutes to settle down in the back.
Practice your statement.
My family's good. I'm on.
Is that? I don't know what it is. I think we could put schemes there. You got some of those girls.
Yeah. You can just on both presentations.
Okay, you're amazing. It's fine, it's fine.
Okay, we're gonna get started again. Sorry to interrupt these conversations. Thank you. All right.
Hi everyone. Our project focused on tracking the reentry phase for individuals post incarceration and legendary legacies. My name is Bobby Bhagavathula.
My name is Chen Hongyi.
I'm Cole.
And I'm Nicholas Rosnani. Alright, so here's a brief overview of what we're going to be covering today during our presentation. So we're going to start by giving you guys some background information about Legendary Legacies, who they are, where they're from, and overall like their mission and purpose as a reentry organization in the industry. And we're also going to outline some of the issues with tracking the reentry phase for individuals pre and post incarceration. So we're then going to introduce to you guys Legendary Legacy sponsor, Ron Waddell. We're going to list out to you guys the series of objectives we kind of thought were most important for us to achieve and meet in order to get our project goal. And then we're going to show you guys some of the methods and techniques that we kind of use to achieve these objectives, show you guys then some of the things we learned throughout working with Legendary Legacies in their organization throughout this entire project. Then we're going to reveal to you guys some of the advice and final deliverables we have to showcase and provide to Legendary Legacies that they can take with them in the future. And lastly, wrap up everything with a brief conclusion.
And now I'm going to give you guys a little bit of background information of our project. So right now, there's a big issue in this country with post-incarcerated individuals returning to the society And the government also realized that, so they gave like $1.3 billion of fund for the justice system. And there is only 12.1% of the fund goes to the re-entry program, which is not a lot compared to the whole budget.
Like China was suggesting, the big takeaway here is that of the whole budget, at 12.1%, that amounts to a little bit over $100 million, which sounds like a lot of money, and it is, but not for the importance of reentry and the role it plays, and also how many facets it covers, and that budget has to be split very, very thin. Before release, the individuals have to be prepared for getting IDs. That's a huge problem. There's committees, presentations, just getting people to know what steps to take next after release. Also preparing things like housing, medical role, mental health treatment, substance use is a large problem in this population. So getting people on the right path before even the release starts, that's how you really meet success at the end. And upon release too, the budget is also split between community stakeholders and other treatment programs like federally funded reentry organizations. When all of those work together, you can really achieve success in community integration for these individuals. But if any of those are slacking, it's a problem. So reentry organizations, nonprofits have started to fill those gaps.
Yeah, and with how exhausted the reentry phase is for these individuals post-incarceration, their social lives start to take a big regression. This graph suggests that about 70% of these individuals after the first week of release spend their time being alone. And about 30% of these individuals are with family and friends, and there's overlap. This is not ideal. Social support is paramount for a successful reentry. Up to 56% of individuals in this study, in fact, struggled with mental health issues. And our job is, or the whole goal is to try to optimize the time in participating in social programs, being with family and friends, and minimize the time being alone.
So one of the groups trying to face this is Legendary Legacies, our sponsor organization. Legendary Legacies is a nonprofit reentry organization working with young men in the Worcester area. They work with the highest risk individuals. So anyone who really needs help, and a lot of other people have given up on, that's where Legendary Legacies really fills their role. So we're working particularly with Mr. Ron Waddell, the executive director and co-founder of Legendary Legacies. What you can't see from here, Ron is very, very incredibly passionate, and it rubs right off on you about the work he does and everything. He really cares a lot about the community and helping out and making sure these individuals are put off the best chance of success, and really helping fill everything that's going wrong. Legendary Legacies is trying to step in and make changes to that.
All right, so one of the main things about Legendary Legacies is that Legendary Legacies needs assistance making data-informed decisions. So what that exactly means is that Legendary Legacies, much of the data that they're currently tracking for the state for funders is quantitative, and not really qualitative. And like the quantitative data that they're currently tracking is just question. They could easily get, like life coaches could easily ask like some of the participants like these questions, and they would be able to get this quantitative data from them. But they're currently at the moment not tracking any of the qualitative things that life coaches would get to know about participants when they get to know them on a personal level, other than taking notes of those kind of things mentally. So they want to expand on this by tracking this qualitative data to be able to show other organizations and their funders how successful their organization is with working with these participants, and also be able to provide participants how well they are doing within the organization.
So with all the background information and introduction of the Legendary Legacy, you may be wondering how we're gonna solve the situation. Well, we cannot solve the situation. However, there's a small favor we can do with our project. So our project goal is to identify an efficient method to track qualitative KPI of successful reentry and foster data inform the decision making at Legendary Legacies. And to achieve this goal, we have 3 steps to go. The first objective is to gain an understanding on how Legendary Legacy gather their data and process their data. And then investigate. The second step is to investigate on how other reentry organizations to collect their data and measure their qualitative KPI. And the final stage is to literally develop a plan to implement a new strategy for tracking successful reentry at Legendary Legacies.
Yeah, and so now that we mentioned what our objectives were and our goals, we wanted to talk about how we approach this. So let's talk about the methodology. So to kick things off on our project, we conducted semi-structured interviews with Ron and all the life coaches at Legendary Legacies. These interviews were no more than 30 minutes and were administered either through a phone call or Zoom. But the one thing that we wanted to emphasize in these interviews and talk about is that what were some of the qualitative key performance indicators that that the life coaches knew that were really important for successful reentry, but hard to measure, hard to track over time, and that are not measurable during every engagement. So we took all that data and transcribed them to documents. And after we transcribed them, we filtered the highly similar responses and grouped them up into different themes. We'll explain later in our findings what the results came out to. And then after we grouped them up into different themes, we then determined there were three really important KPIs that we found from the life coaches that were important, and we wanted to try to go for it.
All right, so we also performed semi-structured interviews with other reentry organizations. So out of a series of reentry organizations that we reached out to, we were able to meet with two, Lily Elkins from Roca and Soccer Long from UTEC. So we reached out to these reentry organizations in hopes of trying to see if they have some sort of method or tool they're currently using to kind of measure and track these qualitative key performance indicators of their participants. So during our interview with Lily Elkins from Roca, we learned a lot about their organization. They work very well with their participants and have a lot of history as a reentry organization in this industry. But they also seem to struggle with this issue of kind of measuring these qualitative KPIs for their participants. They understand that qualitative KPIs are a huge part of a participant's success when working with these reentry organizations, but they're just not being covered at the moment. The same thing went when we met with Soccer Long from UTEC. We learned a lot about their organizations and how they really interact with the participants, which makes them different from other reentry organizations, but they still seem to have this issue of kind of measuring or having a method to measure and track these qualitative KPIs. So we then performed an analysis of already existing tools, and the most prominent one for Legendary Legacies is the Ohio Risk Assessment System, also referred to the ORAS assessment. And we performed an in-depth analysis of this assessment to kind of really gauge and see what kind of data is Legendary Legacies collecting to provide for their funders and for the state. And we used this assessment to kind of see what was already being asked and what was missing. So then we could kind of see and focus more on the things that were not being asked by the assessment, so we could help Legendary Legacies better evaluate and track these things that are not being included.
And also we had an interview with one of the WPS professor, Andrew C. Trapp. He's an expert in mathematical analyzing and data collection, so he gave us a lot of recommendations on how we may want to design the questions and answers with the Likert skills. And eventually we created a draft of the post-engagement data entry form with all the information we had from interview and other organizations and Professor Trapp. And after we routinely meeting with Mr. Rong, and get some feedback from him and address his concerns, and eventually we show the form to all the life coaches at Legendary Legacies to like get any feedback to eventually have a final version of the form.
All right, so for our finding section here, we're just going to outline to you some of the things we learned while working with Legendary Legacies and their team, and meeting with the 7 life coaches there, and also reaching out to the reentry organizations. So one of the main things that we learned about is that there is a significant need for collecting qualitative data in the reentry space. So after interviewing the 7 life coaches at Legendary Legacies, all of them outlined and kind of gave us a series of qualitative KPIs that are very important and a big part of participant success, but are just not currently being tracked. There's no sort of method to kind of track these at the moment. And we learned the same from reaching out to Lily Elkins from Roca and Soccer Long from UTEC. And we found that they also seem to be struggling with this issue. So it's not just Legendary Legacies that is struggling with kind of measuring qualitative KPIs, but it's also other reentry organizations. Another main thing that we learned is that the life coaches at Legendary Legacies value well-being, relationships, and accountability the most. So specifically during the 7 interviews with each of them, we found that these are some of the recurring qualitative KPIs that were mentioned during the interview, such as mental health, under the category well-being, loyalty networks under the category relationships, and punctuality decision-making under accountability. So after performing an in-depth analysis of the ORAS assessment, we found that the themes that you guys see here filled and highlighted in light blue were things that were not being tracked by the ORAS assessment at all, whereas the things that you guys see here filled and highlighted in yellow were things that the ORAS asked a question or two about, but they were very minimal and weren't as effective in kind of gauging a participant's success within these KPIs. So after performing this analysis, we kind of knew what to look more closely into, which is specifically the things that you guys see here highlighted in blue, and we also looked at and added some supplements to the things highlighted in yellow.
Yeah, Nick was mentioning how, well, although some of the themes were addressed in the ORAS, majority of the ORAS is more so quantitative purposes than qualitative. The ORAS is about a 60-minute exam that is administered every 6 months for these participants, and it talks about and it assesses these participants about their prior offenses, their criminal history, education, employment, and financial situation. Overall producing a risk factor in terms of how likely they are to recidivate in society. Although that is an integral part of in re-entry phase, it's not the main focus, especially for Legendary Legacies. They want to build upon the positive behaviors for these individuals and participants from a strengths-based approach. They want to make sure how do we improve upon what they already have, what skills they already have, and in terms of then simultaneously mitigating their negative points. And so to do that, when we met with Sako from UTech, we understood that in UTech they have these personalized reflection plans that help them with their participants. They meet once a week. That will be their engagement, and it's personalized. And the reflection is so that way the participant can be independent with their lifestyle. They don't need to be micromanaged or spoon-fed, and it's a great way because these participants, they go through a lot. They are over-assessed with the parole officers, correctional managements, and things like that. And so having like these sort of transparent, non-invasive assessments helps them grow, and at the same time making it so that the life coaches are there for assistance.
With our findings in mind, we made the following 3 recommendations we encourage Legendary Legacies to pursue in the future. The first being, we want them to use our post-engagement data entry form to track their qualitative KPIs. When we made this, we worked directly with Ron, we worked with the life coaches to make sure we made it so that they know how to use it, and it was what they were looking for. We pulled a lot of the fields from the ORAS and adapted them. We took the best qualities, but instead of meeting every 6 months and filling this out, we wanted it to be a more frequent thing so we can get intermittent data. We want to see after every single engagement what the life coach perceives in the following fields here. The first page is designed to cover punctuality, trust briefly, as well as any other case management notes, any loose comments that the life coaches feel are important. And then the following pages are meant to be completed at the life coach's discretion, whether or not the conversation really suited and answered those fields. So we encourage that. We also encourage Legendary Legacies to make use of, along with our post-engagement, it's a long name, post-engagement data entry form, we encourage them to use our scales as well to interpret the data. Doing just data collection without knowing what it means doesn't add anything for anyone. So when you use these scales, we talked with Dr. Trapp, and he recommended using Likert scales to really reflect growth over time. So these Likert scales range on a scale of 7 to 4 points, depending on the field. The range of this really helps reflect growth over time. You can say on this day he was a 4, the other day he was a 3, now he's a 5. You can really see how change over time is reflected throughout the scales, as well as the 4-point scales on some questions leave it more up to the life coach's interpretation of which extreme they were leaning towards. Really helps prevent misinterpretation of the midpoint there. And lastly, we encourage a future collaboration between WPI and Legendary Legacies. We are the first group to go in as Legendary Legacies and really establish this project. But we think the secret to interpreting how success is really looked at for people
post-incarceration really lies in these qualitative indicators that we're only starting to look into. So a future NQP or an IQP project between Legendary Legacies and WPI really we think is the right way to go with this. One thing we've talked about briefly is just first up a data visualization tool. We think some way to look at the form data that we're collecting and really interpret that less numbers based and more you can see the growth visually. It's going to help move that forward.
Yeah, so we wanted to conclude with a proverb that was engraved in the Legendary Legacies logo. We'd like to have a special thanks to Laura and Stephen for helping us this semester, and Ron and Legendary Legacies for giving us just a great project to work on, and we love contributing to such a great cause. We're open to taking any questions.
Were you able to evaluate all the consistency of responses among the life coaches? So whether they were evaluating their clients using the same kind of metric, or was there subjectivity involved, like a particular client might be evaluated differently by two different coaches?
Sure. So that's why we sat down one-on-one with all of the life coaches to see what they wanted from it, but then also we sat down with them as a group to make sure that everybody understands how each field is supposed to be interpreted. Obviously, there's some observational bias. I think, so-and-so's doing X, while somebody else will look differently. The big thing is each life coach gets one person, or each participant gets one life coach. It's not going to change week to week. So even if there is a little differentiation in how one person looks at it versus another, where it's the same person looking at it over time, we hope that growth will be reflected similarly. Yes.
In this meeting with the life coaches, did you discuss specific situations that would be used to evaluate each KPI? Like for instance, trust. Did you guys discuss what specific situation might happen where they might be able to determine trust factor?
Yeah, so a large difficulty we ran into is what is trust, right? It's super broad and nobody can really quite put your finger on it. So interpreting what it means in this context specifically, a lot of that was pulled from the Ohio risk assessment, the gold standard of tools already. But we also sat with the life coaches one-on-one early on in the project to see what does the interaction look like for you and how do you interpret trust to look like? Yes.
Why did you make the decision on the scales to use a scale from 1 to 7 for some of them and 1 to 4 for others?
Sure. So the difference in size is we thought. I'll just back it up. Maybe. Yeah, I can do that. Okay. So the reason we have some going 1 to 7 and some 1 to 4 is we thought questions like mental health. It's really hard to put very briefly in 4 categories, right? But if you have the scale being a lot larger, you can see growth over time where it can say more specifically where they're at a more intermittent level. Yes, Dimitri.
So you mentioned the other entry programs you talked to also are having trouble tracking KPIs.
Yeah.
If your system works significantly better than yours, do you think it could be something that you guys could network with other organizations and kind of share?
That's the dream. I mean, this is a very early thing, but we want to change the way everybody's thinking about it, not just Legendary Legacies, but we want to extend this to funders and everything else. So yes, this is not something we want to limit just to one organization.
And to add on to this point, it's that it's the post-engagement data entry form is that way every month, or as an administrator every 6 months, and so every month you can see the progress of the participant. Like, hey, this is what you said you were going to plan on doing, and this is how you're faring with that. And so having these data entry forms there, so you can actually see the data and present tangible data to the participant, rather than basing it off just interactions, eye test, things like that. Having that actual data is just really important.
Yes.
How are you determining the efficacy of this system?
Like how well it works.
Yeah.
So this is. We just want, right now, there's no way to see progress at all. So this is the first effort of seeing, okay, ideally, it's meant to be used when somebody enters the program, you see these baseline stats, and then when they're exiting the program, you should see positive growth. That's the big thing. It's less reflective of the data, more reflective of the program and the work and the tools that they're doing to promote growth. Yes.
What are some key takeaways you guys had from a data science perspective after meeting with Professor Chop?
The big takeaway from Professor Trapp was that visualization of data is the most important thing, right? With graphs and stuff, that takes it from just being a list of numbers that's, I don't know, a wall of text versus you can actually see and interpret it more, especially for someone not familiar with the material. So that.
And sorry, follow-up question, how about in presenting data to these people and how you created this?
So one of our concerns was, especially for the dashboard visualization that would be done after, one of our concerns was the team at Legendary Legacies works with people, not numbers, right? So they're not trained data analysts. That all of this is very foreign. So we had asked Dr. Trapp, what kind of tools are used in this non-professional climate, right? We don't want it to be foreign and we want it to be easily understood. And you just said graphs, right? Graphs, PPC, number goes up, it's good. Number goes down, you got more. So that was the big takeaway. It was like, it doesn't take a lot and nobody needs to be an expert to interpret it. Yes.
I'm curious about the non-technical side of your project, and maybe for all of you, like what was one main thing you learned from the project that really expanded your engineering education and how you might approach your engineering work going forward? You're like, I haven't done this,
I can take this one. I learned a lot in the aspect of, so as a data science major, I know a lot of everything's quantitative, and there's a lot of visualizations for quantitative data and relationships with quantitative things. But after I was exposed with Legendary Legacies and how much qualitative data and human interaction being present, I think that's really important, just as important, and we want to preserve that sort of concept. I know we've talked about with Ron during meetings on how like they were thinking about replacing AI bots instead of like the life coaches with the like in terms of the interaction with the participant. And it could be easier, but you can gain a lot more knowledge with these human interactions, and trying to observe that and trying to like convert it into actual data that you can then perform visualizations with. It's a really cool concept. That's why I really enjoy it.
Yeah, and I would like to add on that, like as a computer science major, before this project, I wasn't really too familiar with working with like actual data, or kind of like trying to find out how can we like evaluate these qualitative like key performance indicators for like participants. So it was just like a great experience, just learning about like the field of like what re-entry organizations do and like what actually goes into like some of the data they collect and like how we can collect that data to make it easier for these organizations to better evaluate their participants and be able to like show funders like this is what we're doing, this is how well a certain participant is working with. So just being overall like able to work with that data and kind of like interview and reach out to these other re-entry organizations and really get like the experience of meeting with these life coaches, because they've had like very different lives and are working with like participants who have like grown up with like pain and trauma and have like grown up with like bad role models and things like that. So just being able to like learn about like some of the language in which they use to kind of like communicate with these participants was just very interesting to me.
So for me, I would like to say, it's more of way of thinking, like you expand your, different track of thinking, like you don't necessarily thinking it within one direction. And also, like thinking in a different position. Like for me, I was like kind of putting myself into a position as a life coaches to see how the forms may looks like to the so.
Yeah. Any other questions?
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you. All right, one more.
I noticed the little hand. You actually have to registration and
Okay.
Trailblazing the Worcester Intercollegiate Outdoors Initiative, presented by Trailblazers Maddie,
Emma.
Andrew.
And Danny.
So here we have our project trail for today. We're gonna talk about the background research that we did. It's a lot about the mental health benefits of being outdoors. We're gonna talk about why college students don't spend enough time outdoors. And then we're also going to talk about talk about our methods that we use to achieve our project goal. We're gonna talk about the things that we've learned along the way, as well as our recommendations to help continue the Worcester Intercollegiate Outdoors Initiative, or WILI. First up, we have following our background trail.
So to start off our research, we looked into the benefits of nature, specifically mental health, cognitive functioning, and physical health. To start off, we saw multiple studies that mentioned how mental health, when vegetation cover increases in their area, which specifically means like trees, plants, and animals increase, depression, anxiety, and stress has seemed to decrease in all participants, around 30-ish%, which is really good. As well as another study mentioned stress, again, decreasing with more nature experience. As you can see in this graph, as nature experience increases, the stress decreases. There's that one group that goes up. The only reason that this happens is because the natural environment that they're in actually gives them adverse stress effects. So it's really important to find the correct natural environment for you to get these amazing benefits. In the same study, you can see how working memory increases along with that nature experience increase. So working memory is basically your general focus and ability to process information and complete tasks day to day. So it's really nice for college students to be able to focus and complete their schoolwork better. And again, the line is going down because the nature experience gave them the opposite effect than what a good environment would. So another cognitive function is sleep. So in this study, they did pre and post tests after having the participants walk in natural and urban settings. So they have here, it shows how there was an improvement in every participant's sleep quality, and it's actually seen in the nature environment that there is a more significant improvement by like 30% of that person's sleep quality compared to an urban setting. So getting outdoors in general will benefit you, but specifically going into a natural environment will have an even greater effect. Lastly, we're going to go over some physical health effects. And so many symptoms and risks of diseases all decrease with more exposure to nature and getting outdoors. And some specific ones to mention in this graph, all of those have significant improvements, but specifically asthma, type 2 diabetes, and all-cause mortality all have very good improvements the more time you spend outdoors.
All right, so the next portion of our research focused on college student mental health specifically. Between living on their own for the first time, dealing with the stressors of homework and exams and other extracurricular activities, it'd be difficult for college students to actually find the time to go and spend time outdoors and get the mental health benefits that we've seen. Specifically, this graph shows how going on one outdoor activity can provide massive reduction in stress for college students. This graph shows 3 different outdoor activities and how the stress levels get reduced before and after the hike. And this other graph shows this significance of COVID-19 and how that's just sort of added on to this already stressful environment of college students, reducing their active park use, as shown in this graph. But that's not the only thing that COVID reduced in college students.
With COVID acting as a disincentive for our college students actually get outdoors, they found themselves being less physically active and social also eating more meals a day, which all led to an overall worsening of the. There's actually one study that asked individuals to rate their life satisfaction on a scale of 10 to 30 before COVID and during COVID. As you can see here on this graph, the black bars, the black markers, represent pre-COVID ratings, pre-COVID average ratings. The blue ones represent during COVID average ratings. The markers on the left represent male ratings, the markers on the right represent female ratings. And while there were differences between male and female ratings, both groups experienced a significant drop in their own personal scores, with the average male rating going from 29 all the way to 16, and for females it went from 27 all the way to like 11. So this highlights the importance of outdoor time and socializing, not just for college students, but for everyone.
And then some background for the Worcester Intercollegiate Outdoors Initiative, or WIOI as we'll call it throughout the project. Originally, our sponsor started the Clark Outing Club, and that eventually expanded into the Nature Connection, which worked more with the Greater Worcester Land Trust to do more local hikes, and the Outing Club did more like weekend type events. Basically, the WIOI eventually became a standalone initiative using this experience and knowledge from the Outing Club and Nature Connection.
So from this background information, we then constructed our goal and objectives for our project term. Our goal was to improve the mental and physical health of Worcester College students by revitalizing the WIOI and creating a sustainable plan for it to continue into the future after our project term. Our first objective was to gauge interest, availability, and ability among Worcester College students, faculty, clubs, and community organizations. Next, we planned, promoted, and executed our outdoor hike and collected college student feedback from that hike experience. Finally, we created and presented our proposal to promote and execute more outdoor activities using the current framework of the WIOI. So moving on to the path of our investigations and our methods. Firstly, we sent out a survey to as many college students as we could. As seen by the graph on the left here, we got responses from these Worcester colleges, 263 total responses. This survey sort of asked about what sort of outdoor activities these college students had been doing, what they're interested in, what their transportation situation was like. Basically, any information that we need to schedule outdoor events, we gained from this survey.
So another part of our data gathering was interviews that we did. We did 17 total interviews at, we had representatives from all Worcester colleges. We also had a few external organizations. But from these interviews, we tried to gather how these schools advertise events, what aspects of well-being that they targeted, as well as how they, what type of events they run. We also use these interviews as sort of a pitch for the program so that we could have someone at each school that we could contact and say like, hey, we're running this event, can you help us advertise?
After we collected data, we ran our pilot hike the weekend before Thanksgiving at the Cascades. This flyer you see here for the hike was actually made by our graphic designer, Maddie. And with the flyer, we got 23 responses, about 23 people interested in the hike, and about 15 RSVP confirmed hikers for the day of the hike. Before and after the hike, the actual hike, we asked our participants to take a survey that was meant to gauge their perceived well-being, so we could compare their perceived well-being before and after the hike to see if there was any effect from the outdoors on their well-being. We also asked in the post-hike survey how we can improve upon the hike, how we could better bring out these benefits of the outdoors, how we can make it less strenuous if it was on our hikers. There wasn't any one major popular suggestion, so we think the hike was an overall success. But there were a lot of one-off suggestions that would make it less, taxing on our hikers, such as better stretching before really steep inclines, because there wasn't one in the first minute of the hike. But overall, the hike was a success.
Last objective we did was create a proposal for our sponsor. So some of the deliverables that are in this are an email list that has all the different contacts that we've used throughout the term, and the general who should be contacted and to keep in touch with to make sure that these connections aren't lost in the future. Next, we have a color palette as well as potential logo concepts and ideas. which will help complete the design and give a professional way for the WIY to be seen in the future. We also have some platforms, specifically Instagram and other ways of marketing to get the word out about the WIY. And lastly, we have a timeline that gives some steps and ideas of how to continue working with what we have and make sure the WIY properly markets and completes in the future. So from the path of our investigation, there were a bunch of treasures found along the trail.
So our first treasure or finding was that time outdoors improves mental health. So on the left, we have our pre and post hike survey. We asked our participants to rank themselves on a scale of 1 to 10 for their perceived well-being. So the brown is the pre-hike, green is the post-hike. As you can see, the minimum for the pre-hike was 1, so someone was having a bad day, but that minimum jumped up to 7 on the post-hike, so that's a pretty good increase. And our mean was 6.17 for the pre-hike, and that went to 8.92 for the post-hike. That's a 44.6% increase. So we saw a significant increase in perceived well-being. Another thing that we learned is that planning outdoor activities has a lot of obstacles. So the graph on the left is from our survey that we sent out. We asked students when they were available, and the most available time was Sunday afternoon with 115 out of 263 participants. So really at any given time, you have less than half the people available, and that makes it very difficult to run an event. The other thing that we did, we have transportation availability, so we had to end up carpooling with some students to get them there. And a lot of less than 100 students had private transportation that they could use to get to the event. And there were around like 70 that had something through their schools, so some schools didn't even have a bus or a shuttle that would work.
So as we saw through our surveys, our interviews with other schools, and even in our hike, there's definitely an interest in the Intercollegiate Outdoors program. As you can see on the graph on the left, 25% of our respondents on our survey, they were very interested in the idea of a hike, and 63% of our respondents had actually gone on a hike within a month of actually taking the survey. In our interviews, pretty much every wellness staff member and faculty member was interested in the idea of an outdoors program that got their students outside and also meeting other students from other schools. And even on our hike, there were a couple of students that asked us for Greg's contact information, sponsor contact information, to keep up with the initiative and also know about future events.
Another one of our findings was that we found that our interviewees, as well as people we hiked with, preferred that the initiative was student run. Specifically, one of our interviewees, Janine Wendt, who is the director of HECMA, stated to us that she enjoyed that the WIY, was being run by our student project team. As well as that, we had multiple people on our hike come up to us and express that they enjoyed that the hike was student-led, student-organized, and student-ran. So we think this will be a really good baseline to move forward with the WIY, to just make sure that students are involved, so that students can help students.
So our last finding was that promoting events needs multiple resources. From our college interest survey, you can see on the right, social media followed by email and word of mouth were the main ways that students learn about events at their schools. And as this was seen also in the interviews that we conducted, all of them said that they use multiple resources to successfully market their events to students. Some even mentioned how when they use email, it's really ineffective by itself because many students don't even open emails they don't recognize. So it's really important to make sure that the marketing and promoting has multiple different facets as mentioned. The map of recommendations, which we will go over now. So the first recommendation, as I mentioned before, how social media is one of the main ways that people find out about activities at their schools. We found that participants also mentioned having Instagram as their primary platform, and there's actually 80% of the students that said this. So we decided to create an Instagram account to start promoting our hike and in general for one of our deliverables in the future. We have multiple posts, different hashtags and things that we've tried out. On the left, you can see hike more was one of our main hashtags that worked really well. And now Matt will talk about how there's more other things that marketing can be.
Yeah, so aside from the Instagram, there's a lot of other facets that go into a good marketing strategy. As seen on the left, this is our current marketing suggestion strategy for the future of the WIY. As mentioned, Instagram, very good, very popular for college students to get the word out there about hikes. And email, while not good for people who don't know the WIY, is good for people who know the WIY, want to know about more hikes, and to give that just sort of bulk information that might not be available on Instagram. Speaking of bulk information, a website is good for people who want to learn about the history of the WIY, about the schedule for more events, and just for that sort of information that you can't just fit into an email or an Instagram. Finally, a recognizable and eye-catching logo is highly recommended for the WIY, so that students who have gone on one hike or outdoor activity and want to do more are able to look out for that logo and notice it and say, hey, I want to go on another WIY hike. A good logo usually has a good color palette. As seen on the left side, the color palette there, which we've been using throughout this presentation and on our flyers, is something that, like a logo, can help returning students recognize WIY marketing material, and just in general gives a feeling of professionalism and recognition for marketing materials on WIY.
So sustaining an initiative like this is going to require, it requires a lot of work, as you saw in the presentation. You have to organize meetings with other schools, you have to facilitate hikes, collect data, maintain those connections with other schools. To do all that, you're going to need a team, and not necessarily just any team. You're going to want a team of students, because as we mentioned earlier, other organizations, faculty, and even just students themselves would prefer a student-run initiative. As for how to get students.
Yeah, so in our recommendations, we have two groups that we can use to help get students. One is the TerraCore, it's a volunteer organization. They have a community engagement coordinator that would be great to use with the WIOI. And they have someone who works with the Greater Worcester Land Trust currently, but we think that they could really help the program. And the other option was the federal work study. So basically, students would sign up and they could complete work with the WIOI as part of their student aid. And it would just, you have a steady stream of students at each school that can help advertise, can help run, and can help with everything with the WIOI.
That is all we have. We'd like to thank you all for coming and listening to our presentation. Also, special thanks to Laura and all of her help throughout the project, and our sponsor, Craig, as well as all those who we interviewed and surveyed for helping us gain that really needed information for our project. Also, we have our link to our Instagram page for anyone that wants to know about future hikes run by the WIOI. But yeah, and any questions?
So I know this project was done during the fall, winter part of it, obviously, but did you guys ever think about how different the results would be during the summer or spring, or whether they'd be better or worse, or have you guys thought about that, or do you plan on doing that?
Yeah, so that was actually something that we kind of struggled with because it was getting really cold really quick. So we sort of had to fast track our hike and make sure we can get it out before Thanksgiving, which we did. And that while the hike was a bit cooler than usual, it was pretty nice. And we do think doing it in spring or another warmer time of the year, we would have been able to do more hikes. And I think just for WIY hikes alone, there's probably a lot more attendance to those types of things. So that's definitely, yeah.
Yeah, to add on, there was a surprising finding where people on the hike actually asked if we were doing any more winter hikes because they were actually interested in going on hikes during freezing middle of the winter, which surprised me, but there is some interest, so.
Yeah. You talked about mode of communication and the color palette you used. Did you focus on what content you were going to put out in the marketing? Did you focus per se on the mental health benefits when you were doing this marketing content for the hikes?
So that's not something we included in our flyer for this hike, but that's definitely something that could be included. That's something that as well we think would be useful to put in the website. So ideally, if we had, if the WIR had a good website with all that information there, we could link it on a flyer or something so that people could get that mental health information. We do think giving that information to people is a very good thing and something that needs to be done.
Yes.
Nice presentation, really nice work. I really love the idea at the end about having work study students who can actually contribute to this and get paid for it. I wonder if you could get any other further thought to what a student-led organization would look like. Would it maybe rotate around to different universities? What could that look like?
Yeah, so the way we've kind of seen it being run is that our sponsor, Greg, is kind of that central hub, and then we just have students at each school, and he sends out information like, hey, I want to do a hike at this day, and those students try to advertise it at that school, and someone rotates as to who's like actually running it. That was kind of the way that we saw it running.
I noticed you thinking for this presentation, in the beginning, you talked a bit about those surveys that you did of folks of the different reactions to outdoor experiences, and then there were some negative reactions. I guess my question is, do you look at different outdoor activities? And then I'm also curious about what those negative emotions are from.
Yeah, so the original college interest survey we sent out, we asked a question about what other potential activities you'd be interested in. So we had things like canoeing, biking, there was obviously hiking, which was the most popular one, but there were a bunch of other options, even cloud watching. So about the potential, the specific emotions and things, that was in a study done. We don't have the specific emotions, but it was basically the more time they spent in that natural environment, their stress increased instead of decreased, based on the different reports and things. The study didn't specifically mention what environments, but so yeah, I can't really do more except for potentially giving you the study.
They were chased by a bear, probably.
That was the theory.
We've been speculating about what that green bar is like.
Definitely a bear.
How'd you guys finally decide on the Cascades? I know it's pretty rocky area.
Yeah, so that was actually, we managed to get out before then and just sort of tour the area with our sponsor, Greg. And it just seemed like a good hike. There was a lot of actually opportunities to cut the hike short if the people we took on it were wanting to do a shorter hike. So we thought that was a really useful opportunity, and that's why we chose the Cascades, so that we could, if we needed to, cut it to a 40-minute hike or an hour-and-a-half hike. But our team actually enjoyed the hike. Then we kept asking, we're like, hey, do you guys want to cut it short a bit? And everyone was down to keep going for the full 2 hours, which we think was pretty successful.
I'm sorry, I'm asking so many questions. I promise.
Keep asking.
Do you think hiking is a suitable activity for, is an accessible activity for a lot of people, or would you maybe suggest other activities if you were to pursue something else in the future, like improving mental health of students around?
Yeah, I know, as we've talked to you guys before, it's definitely not the most accessible. But I think it's definitely, if you can find the right trails and people to help you, it can be doable to an extent. But we have talked about the different potential ideas, which would definitely be a lot more accessible, which we think could also be fun. We just haven't seen the necessarily the interest in it, or the ability to try out those things yet.
Yeah, and also in the ideal world, we want to have the WIY hosting an event every weekend so that people don't feel like they miss out if they miss out on one hike. And if some of them aren't as accessible, there would likely be others that are. And I think just having having the organization be able to do that would really be beneficial in more ways than one. Yes.
I had a question about apparel. So as people go on these hikes, was there any way, as folks are maybe trying for the first time, that you educate them to helping prevent? If I went out there in my Sperry's, probably wouldn't go well. But what type of apparel is needed, or do you guys think about providing that information to folks? Or?
Yeah, in our initial email when we sent out the flyer, part of our RSVP had a basic info, you should wear appropriate hiking, you need boots or shoes, just walk in.
Yeah, that's also some information that our sponsor provided to us, and it's something that he's very experienced in. So I think having those other student leaders who probably know a lot more is something that we would just give warnings, especially based on the weather, if it's going to be colder or warmer. Just giving that basic information is something that we did in our hike, and I assume we would be doing on other hikes.
hikes, or the organization would be doing other hikes.
So I just want to ask, so would you say one of the reasons why hiking is so successful and efficient in reducing the stress of these people that perform the hikes? Is it because of like, is there like a social aspect behind it? Like, do you think like the social aspect is one of the reasons why like it helps people reduce their stress?
Yeah, our sponsor has talked to us about the social aspect of it, and we actually did find that along the trail. People were talking to us, people were chatting together. In the beginning, they weren't really, but once we got everyone to introduce themselves, they were all very excited and having a really great time on it. So I do think that definitely impacts the increase in well-being, that social environment.
I have a question, for outdoors, getting outside, getting connected with nature, where in respect did technology play into this, as folks were hiking? Was it like, have your phone out, be on Instagram the entire time, or really be present in the area?
So, that was something, I don't think I noticed anyone really on their phone, if only just to like send a text, but the vast majority of the time, people were off their phones. Something to mention about technology, there was a bit of difficulty with people getting there with the address, because there wasn't exactly a standard address for like the Cascades. But otherwise, we didn't have to deal with technology as like any sort of issue, which was nice. Zach.
Thank you for this, and it was great, interesting, and learned a lot. I was curious, when you showed that statistic of how being outside can increase discomfort for some folks in some environments, it made me wonder, think about, the legacy about Georgia being a potentially dangerous space for folks, or a space that can cause more anxiety. In some cases that can be culturally or racially based. And I'm curious about any thoughts or techniques you might have for engaging folks who might be more hesitant or might have some emotional barriers to coming on these trips or getting involved with the WIOI.
We didn't specifically focus on looking more into that. We definitely could. I think that's a really good thing to go about looking at, but that wasn't something we specifically focused on. Definitely like making sure that we tell people what's going on, make sure that everyone's comfortable. I know on our hike we had one person that was struggling a bit, so we made the hike shorter for her, and she seemed to still have a good time. So hopefully that would be a similar effect in the future.
Other than doing the survey and stuff afterwards, did you have any kind of debriefing afterwards, just about like how people's experience was, just kind of sharing and connecting, more than just research?
Yeah, sort of, like at the end, we kind of gathered and everyone talked a little bit about their experiences, and that's where some people like asked for contact information for future events, but we had a nice little like, I guess regrouping at the end would be a good way to put it.
That's also where we had multiple people come up to us and express that they enjoyed that the hike was student run. But yeah, that just sort of getting together at the end is where we got a lot of our good information.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.